one thing I've been really impressed with, Carl, and I don't know how you do it, because I'm certainly one that can descend into polemics, is that you actually give it a fair hearing. So you go back to its roots and as an intellectual historian, try to take it in the round and look at the context in which it developed. And without veering into where everyone else goes online, which is, if you're on the right, just dismissing it as this crackpot theory, and as on the left, as if anyone criticizes it, that it's just some kind of paranoia of the right. And so perhaps we begin there. What is the context that critical theory developed in? And let's go from there.
Yeah, well, it's, first of all, just a comment on the need for exposition before polemic. I remember it was a seminal moment for me as a graduate student doing a doctoral paper, my PhD program at the University of Aberdeen. And my supervisor, Peter Stevens, I remember handing the paper back, and I can't remember who it was on now. It was on some heretical group in the Middle Ages. He handed the paper back to me and he said, you know, Carl, I know who the good guys and the bad guys are. You don't need to tell me. You need to explain to me why they thought the way they did. Mm-hmm. And that had a profound effect on me as a young historian. And it's become my watchword ever since, that whenever I try to address any thinker's contribution, that the first and most important thing to do is to try to present them in a way that they would understand themselves if they were in the room. So first thing is, you know, whether it's critical theory or whether it's Reformation history, my purpose is always to try to set the ideas in some sort of context. Now, context for the origins of critical theory, I think we can see them as, you know, there are many aspects, but I would identify two particularly important things for critical theory. One of them is the work of the early Karl Marx, and I'm thinking really here of work he did in the 1840s, when he's emerging from a group they're called the young Hegelians. They're young radical thinkers, very influenced by George Hegel, the great German philosopher. And there are many things one could say about Hegel, but I think one of the things that is most significant about Hegel for Marx is Hegel's really a philosopher of history. He understands that the way people think changes over time. And so what Marx inherits from Hegel is this sensitivity to, if you're looking at how societies think and operate, it's always important to set that in some sort of historical context and ask what we might say are critical questions. Why does this society think and act the way it does in this particular context? And that's what Marx is developing in the 1840s. He heads in a somewhat different direction from the late 1840s onwards. But in his earlier work, he's really asking the question of what is it that naturalizes the way societies think at certain points in time? What historical factors come into play? And it's here that he develops the notion of what he calls ideology. And we use the term ideology very loosely today. Sometimes we'll use it as a pejorative. We'll say, well, that person holds that position for ideological reasons. What we're really saying there is they haven't thought it out. They're just, you know, bigoted and committed to this position as that which they prefer. Or we might use it in a very bland way and talk about, you know, conservative ideology or socialist ideology. And all we really mean then is the set of ideas that conservatives hold or the set of ideas that socialists hold. Marx uses this term really to refer to, we might say, that set of social conventions, social ideas that are used to normalize a situation in society at a certain point in time. So we could go back to the 19th century, look at pre-Civil War America and say, looking at the South and say, there's a whole ideology there that justifies slavery. It's not necessarily a set of arguments, though there will be arguments involved, but it's a way of life that really cultivates this idea that slavery, the subjugation of black people by white people, the ownership of black people by white people, that's nature, that's natural, that's the way it is. What Marx is doing in the 1840s is trying to unmask that kind of idea and saying, no, actually, you only think of these things as natural because the people who do well out of this situation want you to think that way. So that's one aspect of critical theory. The second aspect is what happens to Marxism in the early 20th century. And most people think, well, the early 20th century, surely this is the era of the success of Marxism. You have the Russian Revolution of all things. Well, yes and no. The problem with the Russian Revolution is it happens in a peasant society. And Marx really thought that bourgeois capitalism was a necessary stage between peasants, feudalism, and the communist utopia. So you have the Russian Revolution that really blows the lid off the sort of the Marxist scheme of history. At the same time, you have this phenomenon in the 20s and 30s where you have this industrial nation in Europe, Germany, and yet the highly developed working class there are not doing what the Marxists expected. They're not marching left. They're divided between left and far right. And in fact, they're providing, we might say, the boots on the ground for Nazism. So the question arises in Marxist circles is, how do we make sense of this? And what do we do about it? And in that context, you have a number of Marxist thinkers who recover this Marx of the 1840s. And they say, okay, we've got to engage in a kind of cultural critique here. What's going on in the culture that's persuading working class people to move right, if you like, to move against their own best interests? And what explains the rise of Nazis? What do we do about it? And the answer is, well, there are elements in culture that are conning people into thinking that Nazism is the way forward. And the way to respond is to unmask these contricts as contricts, to unmask them as ideologies, to unmask them as fake presentations of how the world must be. And when we do that, the working class will sort of cotton on to the idea of, okay, we're being conned here, rise up in revolution. So critical theory emerges out of this early Marxism that becomes very useful in the early part of the 20th century for understanding particularly why German working class are not becoming communists. They're heading in the opposite political direction.
There is a lot in there. There are a few things which I think we'll come to later, which is the notion that those employing the Marxian critique would say the reason why things are the way they are is because it serves the interests of the powerful. And it'll be quite interesting to hear your view on what that means in a world where institutionally we have now started to see critical theory and all of its offshoots be the governing philosophy. In fact, let's jump into that now. What do you make of that? What would critical theorists make of that? That actually now we see institutions being run in their image. Would they have the self-awareness to say that this is being run in the interests of us and our worldview?
Well, I think it depends which critical theorist you're talking to. If you're talking to a Marxist critical theorist, they would say, well, this is good because what we're going to be doing is dismantling normal notions of power. And in the wreckage that is left behind, from the wreckage that is left behind, some kind of utopian arrangement will arise. You see this, for example, in a group like Black Lives Matter. When you look at Black Lives Matter, certainly at their original manifesto, they're very, very clear on the things that need to be dismantled. As soon as they move to what's the world going to look like in the future, it moves into what I would describe as rather poetic language. Okay, it's going to be like a village. It's going to be like this. It doesn't have much meat on the bones, but it uses a lot of powerful, emotionally resonant images and ideas to make us think, well, we may not be able to conceptualize utopia, but gosh, it sounds really good and it's going to emerge from this. If you are a more hardcore postmodern critical theorist, I think then it becomes, everything becomes a power game. And even critical theory itself becomes an endless revolutionary power game. And this would be one of the big differences between, say, the followers of Michel Foucault, the great French post-structuralist thinker, and a more traditional critical theorist. When Foucault gives his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in 1970, he identifies the enemy. The enemy is Hegel, because Hegel has a system. And Hegel has a view that, ultimately history is going to make sense and it's going to lead to a certain end, which is not incompatible, of course, with the classical Marxist approach. Hegel and Marx, very different thinkers. One's an idealist, one's a materialist. But both of them in their classical form think history is going to make sense. For Foucault, no. All you have is endless cycles of power struggle. And the game, if you like, is to constantly disarm those in power. You're not building towards anything. You're constantly disarming those in power. So I can imagine a postmodern critical theorist say, yeah, it's a power game. Come on if you think you're hard enough. We got power at the moment. You play the game and see if you can beat us at it. So I could see that as an attitude of a certain strand of critical theorists.